Welcome to Any Landing You Can Walk Away From, written by Clopfic in the comments. Chapter 1. Jetstream usually slept like a log. As the owner of Equestra Air, Equestria's largest commercial airline, he had long days of hard work followed by long nights of hard play. All of that was in addition to the work that he had put in as a single, working father for his 16-year-old teenage filly. So, it was that when his head hit the pillows, he was usually out like a light until his alarm clock interrupted his peaceful rest at the crack of Celestia's dawn. Jetstream had heard the rumors that Luna would visit ponies going through terrible nightmares. Even if he did believe them, he would have had little need for her. Tonight was a different story. Jetstream shifted in his sleep uncomfortably. He couldn't help but rustle under the silk sheets covering his king-size bed. He was having the strangest, most troubling dream. Jetstream walked through the musty forest, a strangely aromatic fog hanging thick all above him. He couldn't shake a terrible sinking feeling that something was completely off, as if there was something dangerous stalking him, lurking after him through the dark expanse of trees. His meek and cautious forest trot was suddenly interrupted as all around him exploded with the muffled cawing of 1,000 birds, only instead of them merely crowing, they all seemed to be moaning. Their little moans of "Dad, Dad," were coming from every angle about him, slowly getting louder and louder. Terrified and unable to comprehend what was happening, Jetstream froze in his only place of refuge, next to a particularly large tree. As soon as he did, the entire world around him shook madly. An earthquake? Jetstream sank to his haunches, pressing his back against the tree as hard as he could to steady himself from the vibrating earth beneath him. As he did so, the earthquake, when its mad gyrations abruptly ceased. His heart racing, Jetstream tried to gather his wits about him and overcome the sense of foreboding. The sense that he was forgetting or running away from some terrible truth chasing him through this dark forest. Just as he prepared to launch himself to the air, the ground right in front of him shifted and rose, a little mound of dirt building up into a fairly large protrusion before peaking and bursting around to reveal a mole. Jetstream almost yelped in fright and confusion. It was a small, adorable mole to be sure, but still a mole with a big, long nose ending in a set of pink nostrils that looked more like they belonged on a pig. The little creature began to snuffle along the ground towards Jetstream, causing him to slide further back and pressing up against the tree. But the mole just got closer and closer, sniffing up his right leg towards his crotch until it was upon him. Before he could reach down to shoo the little thing away, it began snuffling at his testicles. At first Jetstream giggled, the twitching warm wet nose tickling his balls, but soon a new sensation began to overtake him. He felt his penis start to grow and slide out of its sheath, falling across the snout of the mole. The mole only began to snuffle harder, working its way upward and nudging against the base of his expanding penis, which was rapidly thickening and reaching a semi-erect state. Jetstream leaned down to put his forehoof on the mole's head to push it away as he shifted uncomfortably to escape the strange sensations, but his movements were slow, weak. It felt like his forelegs were moving in slow motion. Before he could deflect the little mole, it reached up one of its wings and easily bat his hoof away from interrupting his ministrations. Wait, wings? The forest began to get brighter and brighter, the trees in the distance shimmering their way into mist. The mole was dragging her nose all the way up his now fully erect stallion, pressing its wet snuffling end to the underside of his flare and cutely rubbing left and right against the most sensitive part of his organ. Her? Jetstream looked down to see that the creature was now sporting a mop of eerily familiar blue and green hair, which playfully tickled his throbbing stallionhood as they continued her erotic scent exploration. Just as he began to groan in pleasure, the ground around him began to shimmer and fade as the entire dreamscape began to collapse. Leaning his head back in ecstasy from this sensations on his flare, the last thing Jetstream saw as he rocketed back towards consciousness was what he could swear was a midnight blue alicorn watching him from a nearby cloud with a devious, voyeuristic grin and giving him a wave as his world faded to white. Jetstream's eyes groggily opened, a ray of sunlight falling across his face, completing the task of fully rousing him. Where am I? He looked about, taking stock of where he was. For some reason, his memories were very foggy as to how he'd gotten here, a familiar post-alcohol haze mixing with some other strange brain fog he couldn't quite place. The ceiling was familiar, though. This was the master bedroom in his Las Pegasus penthouse condo. He was in his luxurious king-size bed with his red silk sheets, his back pressed up against the oak headboard. He exhaled. At least he was home. But what time was it? Hey, what day was it? He looked over at his mechanical alarm clock. The positions on the hands and the little date window immediately gave him the information he needed. 10 a.m. on the 25th, a Saturday, the day after the convention in Canterlot would have wrapped up. Memories, conventions rushing back to him, the whole week of being blue-balled and teased, treated like a vapid boy toy before being through the humiliating loss of a big royal space contract because Harshwini had found a younger stallion to ride. His mind continued to reconstruct the hazy timeline, his furious departure from the convention to Canterlot Airfield, storming onto his company jet and demanding an immediate takeoff, the flight back, and the booze, how he'd polished off an entire bottle of apple scotch, being barely able to buckle his seat restraining for landing. What had happened next? He remembered wanting to ask his condo's doorman, Zero Gustave, to send a couple of regular girls from Embers, his top-end escort agency of choice, for some much-needed relief, but that was about it. That brought him to the present moment, where he had woken up, alone. An unexpected giggle interrupted his train of thought, a giggle coming from right below him, from his crotchal region, his private area, his dick. He looked down and saw an unmistakable tent in the sheets over where his groin was. Although Jetstream was a thick stallion down there, he knew his tent was not just his stallionhood making itself known, as it would most mornings. Jetstream might be getting into his middle ages now, but he was still proud that he had a very energetic libido. Before he could confirm his suspicion that his stallionhood had not gained the ability to chuckle and a sense of humor overnight, he felt a fuzzy, wet sensation on the underside of his shaft, rubbing left and right, followed by another giggle. Jetstream sighed, rubbing his temple with some frustration. He had told the madame from Ember's escort agency, the legendary Ember herself, that one of his rules was no overnight stays. Jetstream was always a gentleman when dealing with the agency's girls in the evenings, but he used their services for fun and physical relief only, not companionship. Awkward mornings with strangers hanging about in his house was not his cup of tea. He moaned involuntarily as his dick twitched from a sudden lick on the underside of his flare. It felt clumsy and fleeting, as if the girl was sampling him just to see how it would taste. Jetstream smirked to himself and felt another half kiss and lick. This mare was definitely trying to earn a nice tip, though her oral skills were very unpracticed for a Las Pegasus girl from Embers. Jetstream almost chuckled as the awkward licking and strange parts of his flare continued without the mare taking his member into her mouth. He knew he was too thick for some mares to fit his girth into their jaw, but his tongue work was pretty pathetic. It reminded him of the first time he got an awkward blowjob after prom in high school. Still, the innocent tongue flicks had their charm, and soon he could feel his throbbing shaft begin to leak a little. The tongue paused, and he arched an eyebrow, wondering why the escort was hesitating to lap up his juices. Just before he was about to instruct her to do so, Jetstream felt the mare's tongue tip tentatively trace across the cock slit. And the mare suddenly whined, before chuckling in a whisper. "Celestia, that's gross. I can't believe I did that." Jetstream felt a horrifying, icy chill wash over his entire body. He knew that voice. Hoof shaking, he reached down to grab a hooful of the red silk sheets before tearing it off his body with a flourish. Between his legs was his daughter, Apogee, her eyes open in shock, caught in the act of nuzzling her father's thick stallionhood with her freckled muzzle. A moment after meeting his eyes, she sheepishly grinned and blushed. "Good morning, Dad." Jetstream's eyes glazed over as the entirety of the previous evening rushed back to his memory. His daughter's first estrus, her scent saturating his condo, the preening session that devolved into a lap dance, and then the sex. Dad? My Celestia, the sex. Jetstream continued to panic slightly, completely engrossed in his swirling thoughts. Hello? Equus to Dad? Apogee waved a hoof in front of her father's face, her nose scrunched in confusion and eyebrows arched at her dad's catatonic state. Jetstream was trapped in his memories. He was remembering how he'd pounded his little filly until she'd started screaming his name, until she creamed on his cock, her fillyhood clenching and squirting on him as he jackhammered her into the coffee table, until he came in her while she was in her estrus. Jetstream's mouth fell open as yet another wave of fear washed over him. Don't say anything if you want me to keep going then, Dad, Apogee said with a shy blush before booping her father's cockhead with her cute nose. Jetstream barely noticed his daughter's touch, his physical sensations separated entirely from his swirling thoughts as his mind continued to race. What if she was pregnant? She was a 16-year-old in estrus for Celestia's sake. That is about as fertile a pony as you can get. Of course, she's pregnant, you idiot, Jetstream thought to himself. Apogee continued her little ice cream cone licks on the ridge of her father's flare, her eyes flicking between the task at hand and her father's face, trying to gauge his reaction. One of her hooves made its way to the base of his shaft and tried to wrap around it, her other hoof reaching behind herself to massage her own aching rear. Though Jetstream's body continued twitching and convulsing in reaction to his daughter's ministrations, his mind was still entirely detached, unable to fully grasp the reality of the situation unfolding. If she's pregnant, what will I do? She can't have an abortion. I'll have to take her out of school for almost 11 months. Oh, Celestia, what will other ponies think? I'm gonna be sent to jail. No, I'll be banished to Tartarus. My only chance is to get her a cult friend, make it seem like it was him. Oh, Celestia, just what the hey did I do to my daughter yesterday? Apogee was still hard at work on her spaced-out father. She couldn't quite wrap her hoof around her father's shaft, it was so thick, so instead she did the best to simply stroke what she could reach. How the hey did she manage to fit the entire thing inside her last night, anyway? She redoubled her efforts with her tongue, the tart taste of her father's pre-cum beginning to grow on her. Some deep thirst for his fluids was growing more insistent inside, especially another type of fluid which she could still taste from the previous night. Her aching rear seemed to twitch from each fresh swallow of his juices, her hoof playing idly with her fillyhood, prodding and teasing her rear where her small clitoris was, as she thought back to the night before. She thought she had completely quenched her desire the night before. After Dad had pumped her full of his stuff, she'd felt an incredible cooling wave of relief, followed by a sense of serenity and ecstasy she hadn't thought possible. The butt stuff with him after had been weird, but amazing in its own way. Maybe a little embarrassing to have her dad be in her butt like that, if she was being honest. In any case, she'd thought that after her amazing romp with her dad, she'd finally kicked the annoying estrus she'd heard so much about. Before yesterday, she was sure that her mom and the girls at school were exaggerating. All you needed was a little squirt, and you'd be through the worst of it. Just an afternoon of discomfort, really. She'd soon realize just how wrong she was. After putting her father to bed and exhaustedly falling asleep next to him, Apogee had slipped into an angelic sleep of satisfied mare. Though it didn't last long. She'd woken up partway through the night, and immediately felt like her plot was on fire. At first she thought maybe she'd hurt something down there earlier. Her dad was huge, less long but thicker than the stallions in her Playmare magazines. But she realized quickly that she was burning with desire, not pain. With her nostrils snuggled to her father's back, each breath took in the potent musk of her father's scent, as well as the powerful pheromones in his masculine essence still sticking to her fur, as well as still pooling out of her fillyhood. She had been too tired to take a shower after their rutting. Not wanting to wake her father, she'd slipped quietly out of bed and gotten an ice pack from his freezer and stuffed it down between her legs. At first, it had helped. A little. In only a few minutes though, the pack had gotten from ice cold to body heat warm. She was a furnace down there. Moaning in frustration, Apogee gave in to what her body was telling her to do. She climbed back into bed with her father, wanting to be as close to his scent as she could, to absorb it, to drown in it. She'd snuggled up against the big back, in between the folded wings, and smushed her face and chest against his fur, like she was a dog rolling in his dried sweat scent. Of course, this just made things worse. much worse. Soon she could feel her clitoris winking in and out, begging for a second round of sexual congress with the nearest stallion. Not wanting to wake her dad, Apogee rolled over onto her back, splaying her legs to either side on the wide king-size bedspread. Her left knee rested against their sleeping father as she reached down to play with herself. Almost immediately, at the lightest touch of her underhoof, she began to squirt, forcing herself to bite her other hoof to stop from speaking out. The orgasm just seemed to stroke her fires even further, though. Soon she was gasping at her swollen love bud non-stop, even as she shuddered and shook from multiple orgasms. The red sheets under her were soaking outward, and in an ever-expanding stain, as if she was fully wetting herself in bed. The feedback loop just got worse and worse. As she would play with herself, climax stop, and then only a few minutes later her estrus would be back even stronger. When her father had rolled onto his back for a sleep, her mouth falling open in a snore as one of his wings lay against her foreleg, it had taken every inch of self-control for Apogee not to simply twist around and hop onto her father's lap for the penetrating relief she so desperately lusted for. Ultimately, Apogee was fighting a losing battle against her biology. She had started getting tired of waiting for her father to wake up and help her, satisfy her. It reached a point where sometime shortly after the sun had come up, she had started calling his name to rouse him. "Dad? Dad? Dad?" Not getting any reaction from the Pegasus stallion, she reached over with a hoof and shook him as hard as she could, and though he shifted a little bit, he still remained asleep. With an annoyed puff of her cheeks, she'd clipped under the sheets, still covering her father's lower half, wiggling adorably as she crawled up between his legs and discovered his sweaty, glistening balls. The musk coming off of them had her head swimming even more as she leaned forward to nuzzle and sniff them, like some little animal. And now, back in the present, the smoldering teenage filly was lapping up his addictive pre-cum while hoofing herself, her eyes glued to her father's face as she thought hungrily about how he'd flipped her onto her back the night before and pounded her tail hole, wishing for him to do so again. And soon. Jetstream felt something begin to invade his racing thoughts, a sudden burning need up from below. That wasn't important now, though. His brain screamed back at his body's warnings. He was going to Tartarus for eternity, likely to be sent there by Celestia herself. Hey, how would she react if she knew he'd sodomized his little filly? He remembered his teenage daughter's squeaking shouts as her tailhole spasmed on his cock. And wow, what a tailhole. Jetstream almost began to drool as he remembered. It was so tight and hot, and that incredible feeling when he'd slipped into her ass was no. What was he thinking? Why was he thinking? As a cascade of sexual endorphins rushed through his brain, Jetstream's physical senses finally reconnected with his conscious mind. His need to release had just gone past the point of no return, and he could feel his balls tense and shift upwards. Why was he about to come? Jetstream returned fully to the present. He looked down to see his daughter licking and sucking his twitching cockslit and panting, suckling little kisses as his spasms became inevitably stronger. Apogee! Jetstream reached down to push his daughter off of him, only for her to let out a petulant whine and resist him by wrapping her hoof, still slick with her own juices, around his shaft for additional leverage. She was now pumping her father's thick cock as she filleted his tip. "Hun, I'm gonna... Please, let go." Jetstream's left eye clenched shut, and his wings and limbs went rigid as he began to buck his hips. And the first heavy rope of cum splattered right into Apogee's mouth. It struck the roof of her open mouth with enough intensity to splash little droplets of batter out of her muzzle. The second strand came right after, this time firing partially into the nostril, while only slightly less intense. This unexpected liquid intrusion made the little filly momentarily flinch away from her father's stick stallionhood, which only continued to splatter line after line of full batter onto her. Catching one line across her sweaty blue-green bangs and indigo eyes, Apogee was forced her eyes to close. Apogee wasn't so easily deterred from her hungry estrus-inflamed desires, however. She quickly opened her mouth as wide as she could, trying to catch the juice her body demanded so badly that it needed to quench her burning ache. As Jetstream continued to let out tortured groans, she greedily filled her little mouth with the thick, creamy fluid. Jetstream's ejaculation finally started to subside. Apogee noticed only a couple more strands bubbled out from her father, missing her mouth and landing on her chest, or her father instead, making a mess in his crotch. Finally, Apogee felt the angry and girthy shaft in her stroking hooves stop spasming and relax. She hummed out a disappointed whimper, but consoled herself by taking the large swallow of her father's fluid, a noticeable bulge going down her throat until she fully ingested it and opened her mouth with a steamy, satisfied ah. Sweet Celestia. Jetstream huffed as he recovered from his orgasm and fought to uncross his eyes. He had little time to recover. Not even a second after his vision returned, he felt a tongue playing at his lower abdomen and looking back down to see his daughter lapping up any semen she could find from his fur. Apogee, stop! He pushed her away from himself as his stallion hood began to rapidly deflate. Pouting at being pushed from her father's lap, Apogee began lapping at her own fur and trying to lick at her snout to get more of the aftermath of her father's explosion inside of her. Young lady, enough. Jetstream twisted so that he was sitting on the side of the bed rubbing his temples. We are in so much trouble. Pouting, with puffed out cheeks and her arms crossed, Apogee affixed her father with an annoyed glance. Why? I waited like forever for you to wake up, Dad. I couldn't wait anymore. As she finished her statement, she again snaked her tongue out to try and get a little globule of cum stuck to her cheek, but fell just tantalizingly short. Jetstream sighed. Apogee was always a handful. Just go to the bathroom and clean up, hon. I'll talk with you in a minute. Fine, Apogee said with a petulant huff, somewhat annoyed that her dad wasn't going to bend her over right then and there as she'd hoped. He had been eager the previous evening after all, right? But when he put his hoof down, she knew she had little choice but to follow his instructions or risk being scalded or grounded. With a little flap of her wings, Apogee lifted herself off the bed and onto the floor. She felt her feathers act strangely, sticky and caked as they were with the juices from the previous night. Ugh, I guess I could use a shower. She trotted towards the master bathroom, walking by her father as she did so. Just as she passed him, she couldn't help but flag her tailbone up and give her butt the lightest little wiggles, giggling as she did so. She knew her father had seen the little show she'd given. Jetstream felt the now familiar wave of estrus hormones wash over him once again as his daughter passed him, flagging her tail and exposing what looked like a very aroused and slick teenage vagina, and the tightest, whole, twitching ponut. He immediately felt his stallion hood react and begin to rouse itself, despite having just gone through such a massive release. The fog of sexual pheromones was tangibly corroding his resistance. No, he had to be strong, be reasonable. At least he wasn't drunk like last night too. He had to stay responsible if he and his daughter were going to make it through this. After taking a minute to clear his head of his daughter's scent by sticking his head out of the master bedroom's sliding glass balcony door, Jetstream was on his state-of-the-art communication device, utilizing the same communications technology as his airliners and EASA rockets. Jetstream had managed to acquire some highly expensive miniaturized version of the critical electronic modules that allowed mechanical aeronautical planes to fly safely. This radio Dragonfire hybrid technology developed by EASA was not in widespread use by the normal pony public. They still preferred simple mail service. But Jetstream insisted that key staff at his company, Equestria Aero, had their own modern communication device so that they could always be available by comm phone. One of those key staff members was the chief of legal counsel, Diamond Gavel. There was a reason Diamond, a no-nonsense unicorn educated by the very best law schools and who did her articling at some of the most white horseshoe firms in Manhattan, charged the exorbitant fees that she did. She was the best. That meant that she was also ready to respond to her boss even at 10 a.m. on a Saturday. So it was no surprise to Jetstream that when he turned his commphone main dial to a frequency and pressed the transmit call button, the encrypted two-way signal was established immediately and answered by his lawyer. DG here, boss. I've been expecting your call. FYI, I'm one step ahead of you on the space ed debacle. I'm already looking at options around filing an ethics complaint through our nobles on Celestia's day court against Harshwini, and getting our lobbyists in Canterlot activated to start making house calls this weekend to key officials. The down-to-business, cutthroat but ultimately still proper and cultured tone came over the frequency loud and clear. Jetstream sighed, rubbing his temples. Harsh Winnie and the lost contract was the least of his concerns right now. Thanks, Diamond. Hey, I've got another question for you. Jetstream chuckled nervously as he thought about how he could possibly ask this question without implicating himself. Go ahead, boss. I'm all ears, Diamond Gavel prompted. Before I do, this conversation is privileged, right? Like, you can't tell any pony what we talk about, Jetstream asked tentatively. The voice on the other end of the line chuckled. Of course, boss. Well, except for 2 Hatriot Act exclusions, if you're in Yak-Yakistan or if you're about to discuss a top-secret classified royal projects, we could theoretically be subpoenaed by the Gar and the princess herself. So long as you didn't take an extra long flight last night and are in the Yak capital, or are about to discuss one of your joint ventures of the Equestrian Armed Forces, we're good. If it is about one of those joint ventures, I've got a clever workaround. We could No, it's not about any of our defense projects, Diamond. Jet sighed before brightening suddenly as he got an idea. Oh, wait. That is, Diamond, hypothetically, let's say a friend of mine last night had a bit of a wild night. Are we talking drugs, money, crime, or sex, boss? You pay me too much by the hour to beat around the bush like this. Sex. Well, maybe a crime too? Sex and crime. His friend screwed up real bad, Jetstream said nervously, subconsciously reaching to loosen his tie, even though it was currently strewn on the floor from the previous night's proclivities. Okay, boss. Let me get ahead of you there. I'm assuming you're home in Las Pegasus. The law there isn't yet under the Royal Federal Law, as it's technically a territory, not one of the royal countries, so it's still under the old EUP tribal law. That's actually why we've based Equestriero out of there, as the taxation and corporation laws are so favorable under the old tribal system. Jetstream listened in awe, as his well-prepared attorney continued. Regarding sexual and tribal law, I'm guessing the issue is probably a young mare? Well, let me remember. Under the ancient tribal law, for a Pegasus mare, age of consent is 170 lunar cycles. Jetstream's head struggled to convert the ancient time system to years. That would be about 14 years, boss. And since you didn't ask about the unicorn and earth pony age, I'm guessing it was a feathered friend getting a good pounding last night. Diamond discerned shrewdly. Jetstream stammered, trying to catch up with the sudden turn in the conversation. His attorney was already getting way ahead of him and making him uncomfortable. Don't worry, boss. Unicorn and Earth ages are about the same. Honestly, though, I'm surprised that the escort agency you used, Embers, would send such a young mare. When I did my background check, they showed as being originally founded out of Canterlot under the standard royal law. I also expected that to be founder Ember would be both discreet and responsible. Diamond sounded a bit dismayed, as if she'd miscalculated. Jetstream could only stare at the comm phone in his hoofs in surprise. You did a background check on the escort service I use? How did you even know? Another chuckle over the frequency. Of course I know, boss. You pay me to fix your problems before they happen. So is there a problem here? Jetstream blinked, trying to understand what Diamond was asking before it finally clicked that she was trying to understand if the mare was younger than 14. Nope, my friend says that the hypothetical mare was 16. A bit of skepticism came over the response. Well, that must be a load off your friend's mind then. So, is that all for now, boss? I got a lot of calls to make on this space ed thing. Jetstream sat bolt upright and began to sweat. No. Diamond, one more question. Hypothetically, my friend, spit it out, boss. Well, my friend hypothetically wants to know if the tribal law said anything about incest. A long pause, and the silence passed with only a light static coming through the comm phone as Jetstream sweated profusely. His tongue felt heavy in his dry mouth, and he struggled to swallow. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the radio cackled back to life. Wow. Apogee, huh? Diamond said with a little impressed whistle. Jetstream's wings shot out in shock. What? I never said it. What? A half chuckle, half sigh came over the comphone before Diamond Gavel interrupted. Save it, boss. I'm your lawyer after all. You don't need to hide anything from me. Also, just so you know, that hypothetical friend thing is about the most obvious way of saying I did it. Please promise me you won't do that ever again. Diamond snarked at him. I can explain. She was an estrus. I was drunk. She seduced me. Kind of. Wow, so it was a mutual thing. Good for Apogee then. What? Sure. I met her when you brought her for the corporate family function a few months ago. She seems like a smart little filly with a good head on her shoulders. If she decided to bag you for her first estrus sleigh, good for her. I remembered I used to have the biggest crush on my dad when I was that age. Jetstream swallowed. Do you think it's okay for her father to— Sorry, boss. If you're looking for moral services, you should hire a priest or a guru or whatever. I can't tell you if what you did, what you are doing, is right or wrong, only if it's legal or illegal. Diamond's voice was pretty neutral. Jetstream gulped before she went on. Speaking of which, I'm happy to confirm that there's nothing on the books about incest and tribal law, so legally, in Las Pegasus at least, you're good. That little loophole is probably the result of the unicorn arm of tribal law jurisprudence. Rumor has it that Princess Platinum, loop as she was actually the product of several generations of incest, though historians say that's inaccurate. In any case, it is a little bit of dirty unicorn history. Diamond chuckled. Oh, whew. Jetstream slightly relaxed. Okay then, boss, glad to be of service. I'll get back to you dealing with the fallout from losing the contract. Diamond paused for a moment. I should warn you that if you put a full in Apogee, it'll make your will and inheritance structure get pretty complicated, which, now that I think about it, means that I'll have to charge you a mountain of bits to rework it all. So, in the incestuous of my mortgage and the new wardrobe I'm saving up for, have a good time, I guess. Jetstream could have done a split take if he was drinking something. But before he could reply, the line went fully silent and the call transmit/receive light in his comphone went dim. Standing up, he rubbed his temples as he walked around the master bedroom. He didn't understand why he was still so stressed after getting the good news from Diamond Gavel. All he had to do now was to settle the things with Apogee. To take her to understand what they did was wrong, and they needed to stop and keep it a secret. Forever. He pushed open the door and opened his mouth. We need to— Jetstream looked over at his daughter. Apogee was perched near the toilet, a wad of toilet paper held in her hoof, as she stood spreading her ass cheeks by gripping them with the wingtips so she could wipe more easily. She looked up slowly at her father, her face burning a brilliant shade of crimson. Apogee's pupils constricted as she realized that she was in a very exposed, very compromised position. Jetstream's nostrils immediately flared open as he smelled his daughter's recently expelled urine, saturated as it was with the sexual hormones. A silent moment of time passed as Jetstream felt his nostrils fill the warm, rich scent, which reignited the engine in his loins that he'd only just managed to quell. The toilet automatically flushed, snapping both ponies back to reality. Apogee released the grip of her wings and reflexively dropped her tail across her rear as she cringed away from the embarrassment of her father's sight and twisted away the covers of shame. Lightning fast, she grabbed a nearby bar of soap and lobbed it at her father, in the hopes of warding him away. Jetstream quickly retreated and slammed the door shut just in time to hear the thud against the door as the bar of soap bounced off of it harmlessly. Dad? Gross! He heard his teenage filly squeak from inside the bathroom. So embarrassing. Her voice raised in temper before continuing. And you're always telling me to knock. Yeah. Jetstream couldn't help but shake his head with a smirk. Even after he'd been inside that tight little rear end, she still gets embarrassed. Typical mare. That being said, though, he couldn't help but notice that his heart was pounding out of his chest and his little guy was starting to respond too. All from the sights and sounds of his daughter being fully exposed. He had to shake his head to clear the thoughts of her little tight snatch, which was just as red, wet, and swollen as the night before. He was succumbing so easily to his lust-filled biology. He was beginning to think that the scotch hadn't really played much of a role yesterday. Would he really be able to pull this off? Typical stallion. Sheesh. Apogee reflushed the toilet, her face scrunched up and her cheeks puffed out. She had to take a little leak, and of course, right as she was wiping, her dad just bursts in and sees her in the most embarrassing pose. She was wishing that she'd just hopped right into the shower, but she was hoping to try and get her dad to join her. "Dad, you can come in now," she called out. Jetstream knocked on the door twice before opening it and stepped into the bathroom. "Sorry, hon, I meant to knock the first time. I was caught up in thinking about something." "It's okay." Apogee rubbed her left hoof awkwardly against her right foreleg. "You didn't see anything, right?" "Hun, last night I was inside your tail hole." Apogee blushed furiously, puffing her cheeks out in annoyance, and slapped at her father with a hoof. "Stallions! Dad, it's different if I'm, peeing." A moment passed before her frown turned into a chuckle, which her father then began to share with his own hearty laugh. "It was pretty amazing when you were in my butt, Dad." Jetstream stopped chuckling, his smile falling from his face. "Actually, hun, we gotta talk." Jetstream trotted over to the toilet, putting the lid down to give himself a seat. Apogee plopped down her little rear right there on the bath mat, looking up at her father eagerly. "Apogee, what happened last night?" Apogee's wings fluttered as she cut off her father. "Was amazing." Her energy built up as she wiggled in excitement. "I mean, yeah, the butt stuff was fun, but when you mounted me and then you were, pounding..." Apogee gesticulated with her hooves as she got more and more excited. And then when you came in me, it was so awesome, Dad. Could we..." "Can't happen again." Jetstream managed to finally finish. Jetstream's heart cracked a little as he watched his daughter go from happy, bouncy little filly to a shocked, stunned Pegasus, her face falling almost as fast as her wings dropped. "But why?" Jetstream sighed. "Well, hun, for one, you're way too young to be a mom." He fixed his daughter with a glare. Apogee snorted. "Please, Dad, I'm not some fool. I'm on birth control. Moon tea." "Moon tea?" Jetstream asked, the term sounding familiar. Apogee sighed, looking at her out-of-touch dad with a raised eyebrow. "Yeah, Dad, it's a Zebrakin brew that the pharmacy snapped up at the patient for a few years back. Stops some air from ovulating without messing with your hormones. All the Manhattan actresses are using it because they say it helps them stay safe without affecting their flank growth." She looked back over her shoulder at her butt and let out a sigh. "And mine needs all the help it can get." Jetstream was about to object to his daughter's evaluation. He thought her tight little flank was just perfect, especially when it had just the right firmness when he'd slapped her supple rear on the ground along his Stop? Nope. He was getting sidetracked again. "Focus, Jetstream. You just heard she was on birth control. That was a major bullet dodged. He was almost home free now." "Hun, I'm glad to hear you're on birth control. But still, the thing we did, we can't do anymore." Jetstream shifted on the toilet, his daughter's pervasive smell in the bathroom invading his forebrain and screaming at him to answer differently, to stop talking and simply pick her up and bend her over the toilet, snatch her little tailbone out of the way, and... "Okay, deep breath, Jetstream," he thought to himself. "Stay on course. You're almost there." Apogee smirked and looked sideways at her dad, covering her chuckling muzzle with a hoof. "Oh really, Dad? You can't? He seems to feel otherwise." She pointed to her father's crotch where his fat stallion hood was now more than half erect and had flopped out onto the toilet lid, and it was rapidly getting stiffer. Apogee grinned at her father while wiggling her butt before her blush and quickly closed her legs. That didn't stop her from teasing him even more. "And I know that my plot's aching for..." "Okay, kiddo, that's enough. Listen up. It doesn't matter what our bodies are screaming at us to do. We have to use our better judgment here. It's just not right." Jetstream motioned with his hooves as he tried to avoid looking at his daughter, which would surely end up with him getting caught up in her dangerous mixture of adorableness and sexiness. "Says who?" Apogee's sad face frowned as she poked at the bath mat with her left hoof. "Well, the government for one." Nuh-uh, it's totally legal as long as we're in Las Pegasus. What? How do you know that? I may have looked it up once. Apogee whispered, making little circles with her hoof. Jetstream's mouth hung open, flabbergasted. Did you plan all this out or something? No? Apogee squeaked angrily, still looking down at the bath mat. I just like you a lot, Dad. Yeah, it's a silly-filly crush from when I was a foal. Apogee was blushing furiously as she avoided her father's gaze. What fillies don't love their dad? Because you're special. I mean, I know Mom does her best, but you're always been there for me, you know? I love you, Dad, so maybe I looked up the rules on this stuff once. Apogee slammed her hoof down before continuing with a bit of bite in her voice. But I didn't plan for this stupid estrus, which is making my plot ache like crazy, and then it makes me feel like a stupid lonely little kid, and then for all of that stuff to happen last night. Her face scrunched up, angry and softened, as she smiled and looked up at Jetstream without moving her head. But I was really happy it did. Jetstream sighed, putting his hoof on his daughter's head and ruffling her hair. I'm glad it made you happy, kiddo, but we still can't. If other ponies find out, they would think... Apogee looked up fully with a vicious scowl, stamping down with both hooves and shouting, I don't care what other ponies think, Dad. The only thing that matters is what we think. I think it makes me happy. What do you think, Dad? Jetstream froze. Sometimes his daughter could be mature beyond her years, even in her oversimplistic innocence. It made me happy too, hon, but it's more complicated than that. He got up from the toilet and started to walk toward the exit. For now, we should stay away from... Apogee screwed up her face in determination. She was a product of two very headstrong parents, after all. If she thought she was in the right, nothing would be able to stop her from going after her goal. She reached out and grabbed her father's hoof, pulling herself into him with a tight hug. Jetstream was surprised at first, but quickly realized with all the shocks this morning, he needed a hug just as bad. They stayed like that for a moment, Apogee's head buried in her father's neck as she nestled his chin on top of the messy mane. It wasn't until Jetstream tried to break the embrace and continued his escape that Apogee once again set out to look of righteous determination and clasped her father's hooves as hard as she could before speaking loudly. Dad, stay with me a bit longer. How about... could you take a shower with me? Apogee looked up at Jetstream with her patented puppy dog face. Damn it. Jetstream thought as his heart melted into a pile of throbbing goo. It wasn't usual for Pegasi family members of all ages and genders to shower together. It made things a lot easier to reach out of the way parts of Pegasus, and was an important emotional bonding experience, particularly during times of high stress. The pair had even had a little shower together only a week ago. I don't know, hun. Jetstream chewed his cheek. Maybe now's not the... Please, Dad. Apogee cooed, acting like a spoiled child. She set her eyes fluttering on purpose before switching to try yet another tactic. It's just... I'm feeling so alone. Please don't leave me right now. She sniffled pathetically as she tried to turn on her waterworks. Jetstream looked out the bathroom door towards his bedroom, so close, so far away. He knew what he had to do. Just like the night before, he knew what his responsibilities were. And this time he'd done all the hard work of a tough conversation, the ultimatum that it was over. All he had to do now was walk out of the bathroom, crack open all the sliding doors and windows to air out the condo, let Apogee take a shower alone, and wash off the most potent parts of her scent, take her down to the pharmacy, and find some kind of estrus suppressant, and then pretend this week never happened. And it would all start with just a single word. Jetstream steeled himself, taking a deep breath, puffing out his chest like the bold stallion making an important decision should, and stared straight forward. No. Apogee saw her father getting ready to leave, and whimpered and squeezed herself more tightly against her father. Simultaneously, she trapped a certain thick, erect organ between their bodies, with her left hoof while lifting her right hoof up towards her father's face, vainly trying to shut his mouth. But she was going to be too slow. Her father was already inhaling and puffing out his chest like he always did before being a big dumb stallion. Lucky for Apogee, the right hoof she was lifting up her father's muzzle was the very same with which she'd been playing with her fillyhood easier, and which she had used to wipe herself clean. Just as Jetstream filled his lungs with air, he inhaled a potent mix of neurochemical pheromones about as fresh as the source as possible. Jetstream's mind took a moment or two to fully implode as the chemicals in his nose signaled powerful concentrations of dopamine and testosterone to flood his neural pathways. He managed to utter one syllable before his mind finally snapped, reverting to the fully stallion mode. What the heck was he saying? His little filly needed him, in every sense of the word, and he would be there for her. "Problem. No problem, hon," Jetstream said. Apogee squeed, jumping away to clap her hooves together excitedly as she hopped into the walk-in shower and turned on the faucets. Damn it. Jetstream's walk-in shower was a very classy affair with lots of space and multiple shower heads. He liked to wake up in the mornings and luxuriate in a powerful stream of hot water to invigorate him and prepare him for the day to come. Apogee likes his shower too, and would often sneak in to use it once her father had left the condo. So she knew her way around the various knobs and valves, and by the time he was stepping in, closing the glass door behind them, steam was already rising from the rubber-lined textured floor. Flat tiles, water, and hooves were not a good mix. Apogee was already chirping happily as she ducked her head into the running stream of water, one cascading from above roof like a waterfall from a fancy sprout, while several others fired pulsating streams from body height and below. Apogee enjoyed them all, spreading her wings out slightly and shivering in joy like a small bird cleaning itself in a bird bath. "Ah, that feels great. As much as I love getting covered in it, Dad, your stuff is a little grody, and especially to be covered in all night long." Apogee chuckled before sultrily flicking her wet tail. The cute mass of tail hair was now allowed to be let down out of its bun, though it was still fairly short from how it had been cut. Apogee flicked her tail soaked towards her blushing father, mischievously splashing him with the water. Jetstream hesitantly approached his playful soaked daughter as she turned down the water pressure so that they could lather up. She tossed him a bottle of shampoo. "You start sopping me up, Dad." Apogee turned around, backing up towards her father so that her rump was facing him as she let out the remaining water stream down her wet mane and back. Clearing his throat, Jetstream quickly fired a few squirts of fur shampoo onto his daughter's back, trying to avoid the inevitable thought about how much those shampoo squirts looked like a different substance that he could squirt. He ignored those thoughts as best he could as he began to massage and lather into his daughter's back and sides as a thin layer of fur quickly subsiding up under the luxury shampoo. Maybe he would manage to wash away the estrus pheromones with his cinnamon-scented soap, he thought, hopefully. His daughter happily cooed under his hooves as he worked up her neck and into her mane. Unlike most mares he'd known, she had no problem with him mussing up her hair, and even now she seemed happy that he worked behind her flicking ears. All right, this was working. The cinnamon scent was filling the shower. He could do this. He quickly lathered up her chest, floof, as she puffed it out for a little giggle, before reaching up under the rib cage below her belly. She had always been ticklish, and she giggled again as he ran his massaging hoof over her belly button. He was almost through this. Apogee turned her head back to her dad with a wicked grin, looking out at him from under a couple strands of tousled wet mane. "Dad, make sure you don't miss down there. It was you who made a mess of it after all." She covered her mouth with a hoof to chuckle. And the cinnamon scent did nothing after all. It was almost as intoxicating as a stallion as the sight he was confronted with. And once again, Jetstream found himself only a foot away from his daughter's beautiful rear end. Little rivulets of leftover water streaming down on top of her tight flanks, down under her dock and around her tight ponnet, disappearing into the crevices for a moment before running back down her perineum. finally tracing down the engorged lips of the fillyhood and running off of her engorged clitoris. Though Jetstream could see the amount of clear liquid dripping from the love nubbin was more than he could accounted for from merely the water running down his daughter's back. He squeezed the shampoo bottle inadvertently, making it shoot out a big splooge of soap which splattered to the floor. Apogee chuckled, wriggling her bottom in her dad's face. "Aw, Dad, don't waste it. If you're gonna shoot it out like that, do it on me," she said in a half-joking sultriness. Jetstream frowned, not liking being played with by the younger filly. He had totally been caught up in her pace up until now, but it was time for him to take back control. He reached down with his foreleg and slid one hoof between his daughter's thighs, quickly soaping up her teats and pubic mound while the other had reached under her dock. He quickly began to massage and tease both her little nipples and her sensitive tail hole. "Dad?" Apogee squeaked, her wings flaring out fast enough to send a small spray of water onto the glass door. Just soaping you up, hun," Jetstream said nonchalantly as he brought his hoof playing with his daughter's teats to the teenager's opening, twisting and pressing against the heat of her opening and closing pussy. "Dad, it feels really hot," Apogee moaned, shutting her eyes as some suds poured from her mane down her nose. Jetstream continued playing with his daughter's nether region, squeezing her engorged lips together so that only the pink of her winking clitoris would appear. Then working his other hoof between her plump flanks and labia under the pretense of wanting to wash away every nook and cranny, he prodded and played with her ponut, making her moan and position her rear hooves a little farther apart to permit her father additional access to her privates. "Dad, I'm burning up. Wait." Apogee's eyes suddenly opened and her pupils shrank as she began to clench up. "Oh wow, I'm actually building up. Oh, it stings." She began to dance on her hoof tips and Jetstream quickly pulled back his hooves in shock. Apparently, the shampoo didn't mix well with sensitive mucosal membranes. "Ouch, ouch, 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 ouch." Apogee quickly reached over and turned the water streams back on to rinse away the stinging soap suds. The warm water blasted out from the various streams, and Apogee quickly turned about to face the position her cute little bottom at the convergence point of two of the more powerful streams jetting out from the wall horizontally. This put her face to face with her father, who had a front seat view as her grimace of pain quickly faded into a sigh of relief as the warm water stream washed her plot. She moaned loudly, closing her eyes in relaxation as the stinging needle sensations were washed away. "Better, hun?" Jetstream chuckled as his daughter seemed to melt into the jet streams. Apogee moaned. She opened her eyelids lazily, revealing that she had gone a bit derpy-eyed. Jetstream chuckled. It seemed as though he'd discovered why his daughter loved using his shower all the time. He'd heard joking rumors that a mare's best friend was the pulsating showerhead, but seeing this teenage filly like this was something else. She was high as a kite and the sensations throbbing up through her. Jetstream's smile faltered when Apogee shuddered suddenly and began to slip. He quickly stepped forward, pressing his chest against his daughter to support her and steadying for one of her hooves. "Careful, hon. It's slippery." Apogee slowly looked up at her father, one eye moving at a different speed than the other, as she struggled to control herself under the flood of endorphins rushing through her. "Dad?" she asked drunkenly, raising her chin so she could see her father's strong jaw looking down at him with love. Jetstream was about to laugh at his goofy daughter, when abruptly one of her eyes flinched shut, and she took in a strange rigor. A guttural moan escaped her throat, and her flanks began to shudder and hump backwards at the pulsating jet streams, before she was enveloped in a full-body shuddering convulsion. Jetstream was odd. His daughter was climaxing in his arms again. It never got old. After almost 30 seconds of her spasms, her eye opened again, and she opened her mouth, her tongue falling to one side in lazy ecstasy as she tried to mumble to him. Jetstream couldn't help himself. She was too cute. He leaned down, took her outstretched tongue in his lips like a limp noodle, drawing it into his own mouth as he followed it back to his daughter's moaning open maw, before pressing into her with a deep French kiss. Just before he closed his eyes, he saw Apogee's brilliant indigo irises widen and soften until she too closed her eyes to join her father in a passionate romantic kiss. Apogee's somewhat weak muscle tone meant that their kissing was sloppy, which meant a drool pouring out of her lips and dripping off her chin to the floor below, but Jetstream didn't care. His free hoof rubbed his daughter's ears gently as he explored her mouth with his tongue, smiling when she let out chirps of pleasure, as the jets would cause her to shudder with yet another twitch of orgasmic release, or even better, his daughter fully melting into his embrace as she was racked with another full climax. This continued for a few minutes until Jetstream got a wicked idea for a prank, and quickly decided he couldn't help himself. Smiling, he continued his ever-ending deep tonguing of his daughter. He reached deftly back with one hoof to spin the knobs of the shower column. The temperature knob. And half a moment later, the stream of water went from pulsating and invigorating warmth to an icy cold freeze. Apogee's wings went even more rigid, and her feathers spread out as wide as possible as she leapt 3 feet into the air, before twisting around and quickly spinning the flow valve off. Looking at the drowned cat and completely roused to her senses, Apogee stood still for a moment, shivering bedraggedly in a mess. Jetstream tried and failed to stifle a guffaw. Apogee immediately whirled on him. "Dad?" She had a fire in her eyes when she got pissed, just like her mother. "That was not funny." Jetstream burst out laughing. "Oh yeah, think it's so funny when I'm soaking wet, huh? Well, maybe you should take responsibility and heat me up." Apogee shouted and tackled her father, and she took a step back from her. The last thing Jetstream wanted was to be covered in freezing cold, soaking wet Pegasus as she hugged him. "Oh, no, stop, oh, you're freezing," he groaned as her wet mane and tail sponged freezing cold water all over him. "And whose fault is that exactly?" Apogee laughed as she trotted to her father's side, slapping his face with her soaking wet tail. "Serves you right, Dad." She picked up the shampoo bottle from the ground and squirted some into her hooves. "Your punishment is for me to lather you up in cold water." She huffed from the scrunched up face before turning the pressure valve on again, blasting her father with a stream of cold water. "Ow, mercy!" Jetstream shuddered. Apogee looked smugged and refused to turn the water off, until she noticed her father's erection had quickly retreated, shrinking back into its sheath and shrinking even farther under the freezing cold stream. Quickly, she turned the temperature back to the pleasant warmth. On second thought, I've got a better idea." She lathered the shampoo into her tail, quickly making it a sudsy mop of hair. "You have to let me soap you with my butt. Well, my tail at least." Jetstream smiled as the warmth began to return to him. He grinned, watching while his daughter backed into him, swishing her soppy tail back and forth, his grin faltering only slightly as reversed all the way right up to his chest, her flanks pressing into his chest fur as she swished her soapy fur tail and lathered his neck. He held his ground as his teenage daughter chuckled while grinding her butt against him, before moving around and sliding down one side of his barrel, her soapy tail swishing over his back in withers. His stallion hood, which had so quickly retreated from a throbbing erection back to its sheath under the sudden freezing assault, began to stir once again as he felt his daughter's soft flanks press against his hips. He could swear he could feel the heat from her loins pressing into his thighs as she wriggled into him with soppy groans. When she finally reached his flanks, though, she stopped her adorable grinding and turned around with a mischievous grin. "Well, Dad, unlike you, I'll just use water so it won't sting, but it's my turn now to clean you." Jetstream smiled and began to lift one of his legs so she could reach under and access it. "Nuh-uh, not there. That comes later, Dad. You washed my butt. Now let me wash yours." Apogee teased a little and playfully slapped her father's flanks. Jetstream's smirk fell to a nervous frown. He looked back at his daughter to see that she was looking curiously at his back end. He unconsciously tucked his tail between his legs to protect his various delicate bits from his daughter's rapt attention. That's okay, hon. I can... come on, let me see, Dad." Apogee whined, ignoring her father's trepidation as she used her hoof to lift his orange-red tail out of the way and reveal his dark tail hole perched under his dock and over the large slated-colored pouch that held 2 large egg-shaped testicles. "Wow." Apogee whispered as she began to work her wet hooves around her father's flanks, gripping at her father's tail hole and playing with it. Jetstream squeaked, "Careful, hon, Daddy's sensitive." Apogee rolled her eyes, remembering how her father had shoved his fat cockhead into her tail hole that night before. She moved her hooves down anyway, though, instead cupping her father's large hanging balls with one hoof, while the other played with the thick scrotum. They were so heavy, so smooth. Apogee thought as she slowly hefted her father's balls. She could feel the swollen vessels inside, filled with the semen she wanted so badly. She let one hoof slide back up her father's legs, stroking the base of his sheath. That's it," Jetstream moaned. Apogee smiled, feeling the heavy penis start to slide out of its hiding hole onto her waiting hoof as heat throbbed into the still small organ with each of her father's heartbeats. "Wow, Dad, it gets big so fast," Apogee whispered in awe as she marveled at the sight of the black shaft drooping down at her father's sheath, the head falling out in a way of the medial ring quickly, the whole organ pointing limply toward the ground momentarily before it began filling up with surging hot blood. "Wow," Apogee repeated, breathless, as she softly stroked her father's cock, which was rapidly engorging and becoming more rigid. She did her best to hold onto the shaft, until it quickly became too thick for her to hold with one hoof alone. So she brought her other hoof to help, massaging the thick sausage from just below the flare down to the medial ring and to the base with both of her teenage hooves. "That's it, hon," Jetstream moaned as he stamped a hoof involuntarily. Apogee grinned, remembering what her father had said in her similar circumstances. Turnabout was fair play after all. She affected a nonchalant tone. "What are you moaning about, Dad? I just needed to make sure I clean you fully." She stopped stroking for a moment as she remembered something she had read in one of her mom's magazines that Pegasus mares could do for their stallions. She stuck her tongue out in concentration before stepping into her father's side and crouching slightly, reaching out with her right wingtip around her father's shaft and the potential prehensile preliminary feathers. Sure, it was clumsy, but she was doing it. She giggled as she realized she too could give her father a wing job, just like in the magazines. "Celestia Apogee, I'm..." Jetstream moaned, feeling his daughter's delicate feathers stroking his thick, throbbing erection. "It's important we wash you fully, Dad," Apogee teased, "especially since the last place this thing..." She flicked her shaft, causing Jetstream to groan out before she resumed stroking. "Was in my tight, hot..." Apogee leaned in towards her father's ear and continued stroking him with her wing. "Little..." Her muzzle was now as close as she could get without losing grip on her father's shaft, so she whispered as best she could at his flicking ear. "Asshole." Jetstream nickered and snorted. He quickly broke free of his daughter's grip and whirled about, quickly grabbing the small teenage filly by her shoulders. "Dad?" she cried out, half in fear, half in excitement as her father spun her so that she was facing away from him. With a fierce growl, he pressed her up against the slide wall of the shower until the still running warm water streamed from above. Not hesitating for even a moment, Jetstream then picked up her two forehooves and placed them on the shower wall, pinning them there with his own forehooves while she struggled meekly, before he kicked her rear hooves apart, spreading the distance wider and forcing her to present herself to him. "You shouldn't tease your dad, hun," he snorted fiercely into her ear. Apogee felt her heart pounding as once again the much larger and more powerful stallion was mounting her, this time with her standing on her two legs, her chest pinned against the tiles of the shower wall as he took her standing from behind. Her tail flagged upwards, exposing her teenage plot and signaling that she was ready to be bred. All the foreplay had her aching for him, for her. The difference in size for this particular standing position meant that Jetstream was struggling to insert himself into his daughter. His thick cock would either wedge between her flanks or press into her dock as she struggled to lower herself to the level that would allow him to enter her hot, twisting teenage fillyhood. "Dad, please." Apogee whined as she felt herself winking achingly, her fillyhood clenching vainly against her father's shaft instead of its flare. "I'm trying, hun." Jetstream crouched silently, bringing his hips a bit lower and also lowering the height of his flare. but still was pressing too high against his daughter's plot, mashing against her dock and her tailhole frustratingly. Go on your tippy hooves. Apogee bit her lip as she extended her rear legs as much as they could go, standing up right on the tips of her rear hooves. She moaned out in pleasure as she felt her father's flare trace down over her tailhole and finally align itself with her clenching fillyhood and begin to press forward, invading her teenage love tunnel. A moment later, she froze in trepidation. She'd forgotten how big her father was. Dad? Just wait a sec. Apogee nervously peeped as she tried vainly to stay as extended as possible as not to sink farther onto the fat sausage already spreading her entrance to her pussy shockingly wide. Jetstream did no such thing. It was so easy for the eager stallion to ever so slightly straighten his crouching stance, inevitably wedging his fat flare further into his daughter's swollen lips. Dad... Apogee squeaked out as her labia spread and parted around his drooling flare, her winking clitoris helping to grasp the slowly admit the fat head into her much smaller, tighter, hotter fillyhood. Ignoring his daughter's squeaks of concern, knowing that the fattest part of his stallionhood had passed his daughter's straining lips, Jetstream went to town. He straightened his legs fully, lifting the teenage filly body over his penis. Dad? Apogee squealed as she at first tried to stay on her tippy hooves, only for her father to lift her entirely off the shower floor from just an upward press of his stallionhood. She hung there for a brief moment, her father's flare now fully inside of her and her rear hooves a few inches off the floor as her clitoris winked in and out, before finally she felt more of her father slip agonizingly slowly into her as she slid down his pole. Oh, Celestia. Jetstream wasn't sure if it was him or Apogee who had moaned that out, as he felt his little filly's impossibly tight snatch admit more of his thick shaft. She was sliding down onto his fleshy pole slowly until finally her hooves touched the shower floor again. Dad, I'm coming, Apogee chirped, her face pressed into the tile wall. Jetstream felt a cascade of hot liquid pour down the remainder of his penis still outside his daughter, a stream much hotter and slicker than the water pouring down from them as the shower head above. He could feel rapidly approaching his own limit, and soon he took the latest climax as his cue to ramp things up farther. Gripping his daughter by her hips, he pressed down with his arms and thrust with his legs, impaling her farther. Dad! He heard his daughter yelp and a moan as he felt his medial ring slide into her, her tight fillyhood lips straining to access his shaft all the way into her hot, clenching tight depths. His stallionhood's girth was almost too thick for her flanks to spread sufficiently around him, let alone the pussy lips, but still he dove farther. The spray from the shower stream mixed with the heat juices pouring from his teenage daughter down his shaft and trickling off his hanging testicles. Dad, yes, more. He pressed his powerful legs forward, pushing his daughter up against the shower wall. Her rear hooves were now firmly back on the ground, as enough of his cock had penetrated her for her to stand on her own again. The incredible twisting, clenching flesh of the teenage pussy played all around his shaft and flare, as his daughter's spasms were communicated to him through a fleshy medium of powerful but immature teenage filly vaginal musculature. Finally, he hilted her, feeling his flare wedging against the entrance of her cervix. His constant pressuring became a series of staccato, miniature thrusts as he drove his daughter's body against the warm, wet shower tiles. Dad. Apogee began squeaking with each thrust. She hadn't called him daddy in years, and for some reason it made him thrust into her even harder, his heavy balls swinging and slapping on the top of her pubic mound. Daddy. One of Apogee's squeaks became a constant squee of orgasmic bliss, and she climaxed around his thick shaft. He could feel her fillyhood rhythmically milking him, her cervix dipping down, plant itself firmly against him, suddenly expanding, unrigid flare, and he could hold back no longer. Buck! Jetstream reached forward and nipped his daughter's neck as he exploded deep within her. Heavy splatter after heavy splatter shot from his flare into his daughter's teenage womb with no fear of pregnancy. Jetstream had no hesitation in filling his little filly up as the stallion drove kicked his hips forward in each ejaculation, pumping and throbbing into the needy teenage snatch. Apogee's eyes opened with a drowsy, drunken stupor as she mumbled out, "Yes, fill me, Dad." Jetstream obliged her, still nipping her neck as he drove pump after pump. He lost count after about 15, but there was no doubt that his little girl had taken enough in her to have noticeably swollen her lower abdomen. And finally, his orgasm subsiding, Jetstream took a deep breath and released his love bite before reaching over and turning off the shower stream. He could still feel his daughter writhing in climax around him as he stepped back from her, relieving some of the pressure that had been mashing her into the wall and allowing her to drop back to all fours. Not wanting to put all his weight on his shuddering and still shaky little girl, Jetstream pulled back gently, his softening cock still fat flare stuck in Apogee, still clenching vice-like vaginal lips. So it was with a little difficulty that Jetstream finally managed to free himself from his little daughter's fillyhood with an audible pop. Immediately, a few thick splashes of semen poured from the swollen tunnel. As the wet shower floor below exhausted, Apogee immediately fell to her haunches in an awkward spread half-squat, half-sit. She looked over her shoulder at her father, still panting with her whole chest as his batter streamed out of her fillyhood in a steady thick torrent. She looked at him with post-orgasmic smile. "Wow." Jetstream smiled back, tussling her hair before opening the shower door and grabbing a towel from a nearby hook. "Hey, Dad, where you going?" Apogee panted, twisting around to watch her father quickly toweled and began to exit the bathroom. He looked back at her with a smile. "I'm going to the pharmacy and getting us both some kind of suppressant before we end up putting each other in the hospital. I figured I've got about 5 minutes of post-coital sanity before we end up running each other's brains out again." "Aw, what's so bad about that?" "Listen, hon, you shower up again and then get something to eat and drink. I'll be back in 15 minutes tops. Promise me you won't go anywhere while you're in this state." Jetstream felt his nostrils flare up again at the still lingering scent of his daughter's heat. Maybe he had less than 5 minutes. "I promise." She looked up at her father with a smile. "Dad?" Jetstream glanced back, still halfway in and out of the bathroom, and already feeling his erection beginning to strengthen. "Yes, hon?" "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, hon. Shower up your feather butt." Jetstream stuck his tongue out as he quickly sprinting to the door. "Feather butt?" Apogee's cheeks puffed out. Jetstream got to the bottom of the penthouse, only magically powered lift, a necessity in new high-rise buildings like the ones he lived in, and exited out into the lobby. The young Earth pony wearing a fez zipped over to him immediately, opening the lift door. "Good morning, Mr. Jetstream. I trust all is well with you?" Jetstream grunted. "Fine, Zero. Is there a reason you didn't send up the escort girls like I asked last night?" Zero bowed apologetically. "My sincerest apologies, sir. You were quite beside yourself yesterday evening, and when I told you that your daughter was over earlier than expected, I exercised my best judgment and withheld your usual request for embers." Jetstream sighed. There was no reason to get angry at Zero, probably the best doorman in Las Pegasus or in Equestria. "Never mind, Zero. You were right after all, but I've had a very serious request for you." "Yes, sir?" Zero asked, following a short-managed Pegasus out to the sidewalk. "Under absolutely no circumstances is any pony to go up or down from the penthouse suite until I return. Is that understood?" Jetstream pointed sternly with his hoof to the diligently uninformed Earth pony. "Yes, sir. I will guard the elevator's access as if it were my newborn foal," Zero said seriously, held over his heart. Jetstream finally relaxed, taking a deep breath of relief. If Zero was on point, no pony, not even a princess, could find their way up the elevator. "Thank you, Zero. My trust in you is well founded. By the way, where's the nearest pharmacist?" 2 blocks that way, sir." As they both looked down in the direction of the nearby pharmacy, neither noticed a cyan blue Pegasus mare in a grimy tank top fly directly onto the balcony of the condominium building's penthouse suite, which had a still open balcony door. To be continued. Oh my god. Hold on. I need to stretch for a second. Oh my lord. What is this, like 14,000 words? Some 12,000. Interesting. The next one's 15,000. What am I gonna do? It's gonna be a 2-hour reading? Are you guys ready? I don't think you're ready. Neither am I. I'm never ready. Anyway. Thank you all. Have a wunderbar day.